and welcome to Seeds of Hope, Regenerative Agriculture with Elena Garitas. I'm your host, and this is episode number 6. On this podcast, join me on a journey across the regenerative agriculture ecosystem through conversations with farmers, founders, investors, and change makers as we learn how to create healthier soils, communities, and food. Today, I'm happy to share a conversation with Klaas Martens, a regenerative organic farmer from upstate New York who ties in his farming experience with what he's learned about agriculture in the broader context of health and empires from thinkers such as Sir Albert Howard, a botanist and early writer on sustainable agriculture, Lady Eve Balfour, a pioneer in organic farming, and even German writer Johann Wolfgang von Goethe, who criticized the modern scientific method for isolating details rather than observing nature ecologically. Grab a cup of tea or a notebook and join us as we explore how nature communicates through weeds, forms superorganisms, and grows in patterns of succession that shape our landscape. Whether you're a farmer, an aspiring grower, or simply someone who cares about the planet's future, this conversation will transform how you think about our relationship with the natural world. Stay with us for an episode that bridges generational wisdom with modern regenerative practices as we continue our journey toward healing our soils, our communities, and our connection to Earth. Enjoy. Hi everyone. Today I'm excited to have Klaas Martens on the podcast with me, joining us today from Penn Yan in New York. Hi Klaas.
Hi.
How are you doing today?
Doing good. We're in the slow period, if there is such a thing, on the farm. This harvest is done, but we're getting ready for the next year.
Yeah, it's always that circle of harvesting and then prepping the ground, and I'm really excited to dive into our conversation. I want to quickly introduce you to our audience. Klaas and I, we met at New York City Climate Week this year, and Klaas has been farming together with his wife, Mary-Howell, organically since the 90s. And they also operate a feed mill. Klaas has also appeared in Netflix Chef's Table in the episode with Dan Barber, where they talked about farming for flavor. And yeah, I'm really looking forward to our conversation. And Klaas, when we first met, you shared a story with me about the Norse goddess Freya that really inspired me, and I'd love for you to share that story with our listeners and how that relates to nature and has inspired you with farming.
This story goes back to what my grandmother taught me. Freya was, and we all hear about Odin and the male gods, but Freya was actually the most powerful of the Norse gods. And in the story, she was traveled by chariot pulled by 2 gigantic cats.
So she was a cat lady.
Yeah, so at the time we met was right when J.D. Vance had made his famous foot and mouth statement, and I quipped that he should beware of taking off cat ladies. And Freya would be probably the most powerful of the group. But in the Wagnerian opera, the Ring Cycle, there is an episode where the king of the gods is ordered to do something by Freya, and he doesn't want to. And he really doesn't want to. But he has to obey, because he knows that if he does not obey her, that the world will end. And to me, that's a cautionary tale for how we go about in dealing with the earth, because Freya was Mother Earth.
Yeah, I love that story, and I think mythology carries so much weight because it's been passed on for generations and holds some kernel of truth. So tying that to the wisdom of, let's say, obeying nature and observing nature and understanding nature as a system, modern agriculture seems to not necessarily follow those principles. What do you think about looking at nature as a system versus isolating parts of it?
But we're taught to look at practices in farms, and we kind of avoid systems. One of my favorite authors is Goethe, who inspired Rudolf Steiner. And Goethe wrote that in living nature, nothing happens which is unconnected to the whole. That everything you do is tied to everything else. And we have trouble seeing it that way. I also think we have a problem when we're dealing with nature and asking the right question. If we see a fungal disease in our field, or if we have an insect attack, or if we have a new weed that's causing trouble, the default question is always, how do I kill it? And
Right.
I once was a consultant to one of the people who shook Wall Street in his prime, and I learned a lot from him. He was not necessarily a nice guy, but he was a brilliant man. And he said, the most important thing a consultant can do is to first help you ask the right questions, because the right answer to the wrong question is useless. So it's interesting how that ties across. So if the wrong question, and I'm saying the wrong question is, how do I kill it when we have a problem? The right question to me is, why is this organism causing losses at this point in this system? And this takes us back to the system, because all of these species coexisted before we had pesticides. They would not have coexisted. The system would never have worked in the past if these things couldn't get along. And what I have found, this is kind of using a broad brush and skipping ahead, is that when we have a major loss to a pest, it's actually a symptom of an imbalance in our biology.
So how can we understand this concept of balance and imbalance and really listen, observe? We've talked a lot about that in our previous conversations. How can we understand the system so that we can ask the right questions and look for the right answers?
I could give you an example of how I learned this, and it had to do with a problem. New York used to be the biggest dry bean producing state in the country. And when we started farming organically, dry beans were phenomenally profitable. It was almost like printing our own money the first couple of years. And then the new variety came out, and I decided, this is a bad variety. It just wasn't growing as well. And the roots weren't very good on it. And we started looking close, and it had root rot. And the next time, and we were going quite a few years in growing dry beans, but the next time they were even worse. And the yields were just getting poorer. And New York grows very few dry beans anymore. There was a brilliant extension agent. She was the vegetable specialist. Her name was Carol McNeil. Never got a lot of credit for what she did, but she was really a huge contributor in soil health. And she started to ask, why is it that our pesticides aren't working well anymore? This was across conventional and organic. No matter what pesticides were being used, what seed treatments, the dry bean yields were just terrible. And the fusarium and a group of nematodes were attacking the roots, and just nothing seemed to work. And this was a crop that had been a major crop, that Native Americans grew them for hundreds of years here. So I think I'm describing a system that's starting to go out of balance, where something is going wrong.
Right.
And even our seed treatments didn't work.
So the legume was befallen by the pests.
Yes.
And you tried a few different remedies, including seed treatments, and the pests kept going at it.
I went to acres and came back with a whole bag full of bug in a jug and other things that are natural treatments, and they worked a little, but. And incidentally, the other thing that was happening to them, we started having potato leafhopper was attacking them. So these plants were really not happy. Carol took this problem to the other professors at Cornell, and Cornell did something that was really forward thinking. They formed a program work team.
What does that mean?
Program work team brings in a lot of different disciplines. There were soil physicists, a nematologist, people who studied soil biology. We had a weed ecologist in the group. So we brought together all of these different disciplines, even an ag economist. But we had this group discuss the problem. and try to frame the right questions for research. And one of the group, my old friend George Bowie, asked an interesting question. He said, what would happen if we planted a different crop ahead of the dry beans? That was a question I hadn't heard before. And he did a random block experiment in a field that was heavily infested with these root rots. I think there were 20 or 30 different cover crops. And he noticed that some of them were neutral, that they left the problem about where it was. A couple of them made it worse, and a couple of them improved it. And two of them virtually eliminated the problem. And those two were buckwheat and yellow mustard. And what he found was when the yellow mustard was turned in, it gave off a gas that was a type of cyanide. And it fumigated the soil. And there was a lot of research done because it seemed to selectively fumigate the pathogens. It killed the pathogenic nematodes that were abrading the roots. And those pathogenic nematodes were leaving these abraded roots open for infection from Rhizoctonia, Fusarium, Pythium, all of the different root rot diseases. And once that yellow mustard had been grown, it didn't just fumigate the ground, it cleaned it. And the yield of the dry beans doubled.
Wow. And it was much more effective than, let's say, fumigating the ground with chemicals.
Much more effective. And I tend to think in webs, so I'm going to take you in a different direction here. This is related.
Let's go.
The yellow mustard and other brassicas. And what's happening here is the brassicas have glucosinolates. That's when you eat mustard, that's what's the heat that you taste. And they have an enzyme in the same leaves. And that enzyme clips the glucosinolate molecule and produces the gas that cleans the soil. So the work at Cornell that George did, dealing with the dry beans, it was followed up in Michigan, where they actually did a lot of analysis of what species was it killing, what species was it not killing. You know, they were paying a lot of attention to this technique because Michigan is a major dry bean state.
So let's tie this back to asking the right questions.
So it's a perfect segue, because the question was, what is it about the system that made the dry beans no longer adapted? And when you looked at my farming system, I was growing phaseolus, edible dry beans. I was growing soybeans. I was growing medium red clover as a cover crop, and I was growing alfalfa, all legumes. I had a few grasses. There was corn and there was wheat. There was not a single forb in my rotation. There were no brassicas in my rotation. Think about my system. It was not balanced. It wasn't balanced in plant families.
There was a lack of diversity there between crop species.
And another observation that I made, and this is one of my favorite teachers from way back, and he died the year I never met him, but I read a lot of his work, was William Albrecht, which Acres USA really did the world a service by collecting the Albrecht papers and publishing them so that people could read what he had said. And he used to tell his students they needed to learn to see what they were looking at. So back to see what I'm looking at. We have this system that I'm using. It's imbalanced. But what I wasn't paying attention was we were having a problem with a weed that hadn't bothered us before. And it was yellow mustard. The wild mustard was growing in our fields right when we needed to add brassicas to the system.
So you went back to what you learned, understanding what you're seeing. So the art of observation.
Yes, but I was ignoring that observation.
All right. So what happened then?
I needed George to tell me to plant mustard. The field was telling me to plant mustard already, but I listened to George. I didn't listen to the field.
I remember when we first met, you talked about listening to weeds, and we've talked about how nature as a system is always communicating, and it's a dialogue.
Yes.
So how are you looking at, let's say, weeds now on your farm, now that you've gained this experience from understanding what you see?
The first challenge is to be open and to try to observe everything. And for people that are reflective, it would be to pray for inspiration to notice what we need to notice, to connect with the earth and notice what it is that we should be seeing. And it's amazing what suddenly pops out that we weren't seeing before.
Right. and to also pay attention to something that otherwise we might ignore, like a weed. So
Yeah.
why should someone listen to weeds? What kind of messages do they hold, and what do they tell us about the soil, about farming?
So over the years, I've had a series of these revelations where we had a real tough problem and finally figured it out. And every time it's a case of try to kick myself because why didn't I see this before? This was almost screaming at me, but I didn't notice it. And every time I could trace it back to if I'd paid attention to my weeds, if I had asked the right question, it's obvious that the soil was pointing in the right direction.
Do you have an example of a more recent example where you saw a weed and you paid attention and you understood it and led to an action on your farm?
Yes, and I can give you one where actually I first didn't understand it, but it finally got my attention. And then all of a sudden it became obvious. This was a weed. It's velvet leaf. Velvet leaf is also called stinking buttonweed. It's in the cotton family. And when I was farming, I farmed for 20 years with chemicals before I converted to organic. I actually questioned, will I be able to farm this land organically? Because I had some fields where the velvet leaf was so heavy that I just was not able to control it. And I had 1 acre on one farm where there had been a barnyard. The barn had burned down, and that was where the barnyard had been. And the velvet leaf was so heavy that the first year I was organic, I mowed it down. There was no crop. It was only velvet leaf. The next 3 years later, when I grew corn again, I patted myself on the back for doing a better job of cultivating and weeding because I actually got a crop despite it being full of velvet leaf, but at least the crop produced. Next time I got into corn, I did much better. And I kept thinking, I'm doing a better job of killing these weeds. We had a field day at the farm. Actually, before the field day, I noticed that there was a disease in the velvet leaf, and it was a velvet leaf anthracnose. The bottom leaves were turning yellow, and then they turned brown, and then they fell off. And I was thinking, wait, no, I could get rich here. We could take these spores of this disease and make a spray and sell it. Do just what Monsanto's doing to get rich. And I went to Cornell, and my friend there, Tony, was a professor of weed science. And he said, great idea, except for one thing, pointed across the road and said, the velvet leaf over there has that disease, but it's not dying. So then we
Interesting.
had a graduate student, his name was Steve Vanek from Cornell, was there. And this was a couple of years after that. And he noticed that there was a virus in the velvet leaf. I think it was called Albutin yellows. And I got thinking, well, maybe you need the virus and the fungus to kill the velvet. And then we had a field day where we were demonstrating our organic equipment and showing how some of our methods worked. And there was a conventional crop consultant there, and he waved to me and he said, come look at this. You're not going to have a crop next week. This is going to be destroyed. This field is full of whiteflies. And we looked closer, and there were no whiteflies on the corn. They weren't even landing on the corn. They were all over the velvet leaf. So then I got thinking, well, maybe we need the insect, the virus, and the fungus to kill the velvet leaf. I still was being really stupid. I had it backwards.
You were
The
still
velvet leaf,
thinking, how can I kill the
yes.
velvet leaf?
And the velvet leaf, I was assuming it was sick because it had a fungus, a virus, and an insect. It had the virus, the fungus, and the insect because it was sick. I had it completely backwards.
What was the final revelation?
Okay, so here we have to think that commonality does not prove causality. That when you find two things together, we can't just assume because of this, that. It could be the other way around. Or it could be two things that are caused by the same third factor that we're not aware of. What we figured out was that the velvet leaf was not in an environment that it was healthy in. The velvet leaf roots were not healthy. It was not thriving. It was growing poorly. Because it was weak, it was victim to every pest and every pathogen that came along. So I'm going to change gears on you here and throw a question. What would happen if you abandoned an intensively farmed piece of farmland? And just what would happen if first year if you just didn't do anything?
Would you probably get some weeds growing on it?
You're right. You'd have weeds. And when I ask farmers, I can put them on the spot and they can name exactly what's going to happen. It'll be velvet leaf. There'll be pigweed. There'll be palmer amaranth, lamb's quarter, ragweed, foxtail. It's the usual suspects, which incidentally My Native American friends called those the white man's footprints because they didn't have those in their fields.
Oh, interesting.
Those weeds followed Western farmers. Somebody should have noticed that and asked why, but they didn't. Or if they did, it didn't go anywhere. And if you look at these weeds, some of them make over 1 million seeds on a plant. So what will grow the next year after we have shed millions of times more seed?
Probably more of the same.
That's what our reductionist way of thinking would tell us. But what farmers who have actually seen it happen will tell you, no, they don't grow anymore. There might be a few. There'll be a different group of species. And the question is why? So first of all, the observation is important. But then what are the questions that we draw from? Notice none of these questions have anything to do with killing these weeds. That really wouldn't be very useful. We know we could go out there and hoe them, but what would that teach us?
Not much.
So the environment changed, and a different group of species were best adapted for that environment.
Let me ask you another question. So what caused the environmental change?
So we didn't do the tillage. Of course, the first year the weeds grew anyway, but the weeds changed the environment.
How do the weeds do that? How does that work?
So the weed roots give off exudates, and they recruit microbes. Those exudates are food for a group of microbes. And this is a case where the soil doesn't know and doesn't care if I call something a weed, if I call it a crop, or if I call it a cover crop. I mean, that's immaterial to the soil. But the plants are actually recruiting and nurturing a group of species, just like farmers will take a group of species and farm them.
The plant is farming the soil.
Yes. It's tending the soil, and the plant will give off up to half of the energy that it captures from photosynthesis, taking care of these microbes. Now, the plants aren't stupid. They're not giving away all this energy to a bunch of parasites. They're benefiting from it. And these microbes that are around the plant roots are doing interesting things. Some of them are aggregating the soil. They're sticking clay particles to the silt particles and then sticking sand particles to it, and they're creating these big aggregates. They're actually making an environment for other microbes and for themselves. So the plant is pushing these sugars out, and the microbes are reorganizing the soil. Every plant's going to make a different change in the soil. See how the plants are changing the soil. I was at a talk once with Ray Archuleta, who's a good friend, and Ray, in one of his slides, he just had a picture of a plant in a pot. And he said, where does the plant start and stop, and where does the soil start? That was a really good question. A thought-provoking one.
Mm-hmm.
It's a system.
Where does the plant end and where does the soil start?
Yes, they're part of a system.
So there's no clear separation between one and the other.
That's right.
You also said something earlier that I really loved. When you asked me the question about what happens after the first weed drops all its seeds. And you said, well, the environment had changed, and so now there's a different weed that will take hold and keep changing the soil. So let's say, for example, we had a really compact soil to begin with after the barn was standing on it. And then the first weed, the velvet leaf, went on it, and it's feeding and farming the microbes, aerated the soil, and created an environment that in a way then wasn't suited so much anymore to its own survival.
Right.
So our weeds that we might think, how can we kill them, are actually preparing the soil that has been degraded for future plants and eventually crops. Is that right? That's
exactly right. The soil is actually acting like a superorganism that's trying to maintain and restore homeostasis.
Can you explain what that means, restore homeostasis?
So homeostasis is a set of conditions in the body that is a healthy body. The soil, when it becomes unbalanced, the plants that are adapted to that condition will, first of all, those weed seeds will come out of dormancy. Something signals them. They can lay there for hundreds of years. But when the right set of environmental conditions are there, it will trigger those seeds to germinate. And those seeds will then do their job. And they work their way out of a job. Dr. Albrecht described this. And he described something that he called a climax crop.
What is
climax
that?
crop is one that's no longer changing year to year. So we have a succession of species. We all learn about this in biology in elementary school. but we don't apply that to what we really know. But the soil trying to rebalance itself is setting up a succession of species. When it reaches a climax crop here in the Northeast, on the better soils, it would be an oak forest. And he said, when you hit the climax crop, there's no longer as much diversity, but you have these big trees would be the dominant species and the ones that are around them. And they are very resilient. They have hit a state of equilibrium with the soil.
So how does that relate to farming, where maybe as humans, our goal is to have healthy soils, healthy diversity, but maybe not reach that climate species end goal, but continue to farm the land and reap what we farmed?
That's actually the question that we need to answer for our species to survive. This is a really important question and a central one. When we burn down a piece of forest and clear it and move it to agriculture, it's a catastrophic event as far as the ecosystem that was there, and it starts a succession. There's a book called Farmers for 40 Centuries. It describes a stable agricultural system that maintained healthy soil, maintained good crop yields, and worked to maintain a healthy society for thousands, up to 4,000 years. Not every system worked that way. You can go into a biblical account, and Abraham was told to leave Ur, and I saw a program on TV many years ago where they went to the site of the city of Ur, and absolutely nothing lived there. And the narrator was saying this was the center of vast wheat fields and barley fields within the historical record. What happened? It was a type of farming that was not sustainable.
So what type of farming does the book Farming for 40 Centuries recommend?
Okay, so I think we need to look. What we're doing here is looking at results. So the farming for 40 centuries stood the test of time. The farming that Ur was doing essentially destroyed the soil. And we can see example after example of civilizations that rose and fell based on their agriculture. What they were doing in Ur was irrigating, and the soil was becoming salinized. It was becoming salty. We've learned since that you have to over-irrigate and flush the salt back out. And then they discovered that barley could tolerate more salt than wheat. Kind of a lesson to the genetic engineers who want to make salt-tolerant plants, because then they grew barley until nothing would grow anymore. It was a death spiral for the land, but it was also a death spiral for the people. The book Farming for 40 Centuries was about the Eastern rice culture. But it wasn't just rice, it was a series of plants. And if we can take that succession of species that's happening, what I just described, of each plant changes the soil, and if the human intervention can make the species that we're going to plant next be the best adapted species for that environment, we can actually direct that succession slightly and take it into a circle. So then we're working with Mother Nature.
So would the circle then not lead to that climax species
you
mentioned?
We would avoid the climax species. And when you look at ecosystems, there's another term, and that's the ecotone. That's the edge of two systems. When you see where two systems have an edge effect, it's usually much more vibrant, much more diversity, and more productive than either system by itself. You can take the example of the edge of a woods.
Mm-hmm.
When you come up on the edge between a field and a woods, how easy is it to walk into the woods? Tolkien described it in The Lord of the Rings, where the hobbits tried to get into the old forest, but it was full of thorns and plants that were barriers. And that area is not being managed so that the forest is able to set up the succession.
Talking about the forest, I would love to take a step back and link this back to the nature or Earth as a superorganism. I was telling you that one thing I learned at Acres in John Kemp's class was about quorum sensing, and how, let's say, one bacteria has all the capacities to reproduce, to protect itself, to feed itself. And then when there is a sufficient or a threshold amount of bacteria together, they can form a superorganism and specialize. And certain bacteria that used to do everything for themselves now are only responsible for reproduction or are only responsible for feeding the superorganism. And that really blew my mind. And so when you mentioned nature or earth as a superorganism, that really takes it to another level.
Yes. So also this idea of homeostasis is that organism trying to make itself healthy. There was a Cornell researcher. She now teaches at Penn State, but she did her graduate work on our farm. And she was studying nitrogen fixation by legumes. And what she found was when the nitrogen level in the soil goes over a certain level, the legumes stop fixing nitrogen. When there's enough nitrogen, the soil says stop. And these legumes actually behave like grasses suddenly. When there was enough nitrogen, there was no reason for them to make more.
So in this example, the soil is the superorganism that regulates the other organisms like the legumes and affects their behavior.
Right.
Another thing I learned about it, and which she also mentioned, is so we have those bacteria, those fungi in the soil that excrete certain minerals or substances that help or harm plants. But you also had mentioned before in our conversations that you believe endophytes are the next big thing or something that you've been excited about. And as I understand it, endophytes are, as the name comes from the Greek, within the plant.
Yes.
Could you briefly explain to our listeners what endophytes are and how endophytes play in the system that we've been talking about this episode?
So endophytes are the plant equivalent of our microbiome. The microbiome is all of these organisms that live inside us. That are us. In fact, humans are more not us than us. When you think of how many organisms are inside us. And we know now that those organisms modulate our immune systems. They can make us healthy. They can make us happy. They can make us unhappy. They have a lot of effects. Well, the same thing happens in plants. And you have that group of organisms that are called endophytes that are in the plants. And just like we need our microbiome to survive. And when we have the right microbiome, then we're healthy and happy, according to psychologists. There are certain microbes in the soil that if you're working in a healthy soil, you come out with a lot of endorphins. It actually makes you feel good. It's probably the best psychotherapy drug there could be, is to have this healthy soil and breathe in what those microbes are producing for us. Well, the plants are the same way. If they're in a healthy environment, they have organisms in them that regulate them and make them strong and make them healthy. And there's third term. So there's the microbiome, the phytobiome, and the pterobiome of soil organisms. And you could do a Venn diagram, and there would be a group in the middle that is found in healthy soil, found in healthy people and animals, and found in healthy plants. This kind of makes sense on why there's a connection between soil health and human health.
Which is a really important connection that I think people are starting to talk more and more about.
Yes, and when we start using a lot of pesticides, a lot of antibiotics, a lot of any kind of biocide, we're randomly killing off chunks of these biomes. Chunks of our microbiome, chunks of the phytobiome, chunks of the pterobiome are being killed off. And the effect of randomly going in and doing this damage is not necessarily positive.
And that's similar to when we take too many antibiotics and kill off the microbiome in our gut. It can cause other health problems.
Exactly right. So you see how this is also part of this regulatory mechanism where we've messed with it. And when it's not working, we reap bad health. I'm going to throw one more example out. I love these examples because they were so hard. The first ones were so hard to figure out, and it seemed like such an impenetrable puzzle. Now it's easier. Every new discovery makes the next one easier because the same principles apply. About 6 years into our organic farming experience, we started seeing Canadian thistle, and it was becoming thicker and more numerous and growing stronger in our wheat fields and in our spelt. If I had stood back and paid attention like I would now, it was gaining in the low spots. It was gaining in the wet spots. And some of those patches were so heavy that there was no crop anymore. Almost every other farmer who was using the same system that we were. And at that time, I thought I had a diverse system. I didn't know what I was talking about. I had corn, soybeans, wheat or spelt, seeded to clover. There were 4 species in 3 years. And when I was doing that, Canada thistle was kind of moving in. Every other farmer who used that 3-crop system had Canada thistle come about the same time. And then our university set up a systems crop, and they did a brilliant job. They looked at what are the farmers here doing? What are the organic farmers doing? And we will manage the university organic farm exactly so that it reflects what's happening on those farms. Exactly the same point, the university farm started being choked with Canada thistle. And I remember they held a meeting among the farmers, and they said, what are we going to do in the management to take care of this, to kill this weed, because it was interfering with production. And at that time, I had already tried something that was working. I said, instead of going from spelt, seeded to clover, back to corn, I went from spelt to winter barley. And then the winter barley was double cropped, so that we had 2 crops that year, which would allow us that fall to plant some other winter grain and seed that to clover. So now instead of 3-year cycle, we made a 5-year cycle. And I remember having quite an argument with my good friend who was the weed ecologist at Cornell, Chuck Moeller, who's unfortunately no longer with us. He was a really brilliant scientist. And it was in some of the discussions and arguments we had that the most things were learned, because they were honest arguments. This was, in politics today, people are arguing to win pitched battles. In the Jewish tradition, you can argue to try to find the truth. A productive argument is when we're both struggling to find the truth. And that's kind of what happened there. And I remember him saying, you have no idea how resilient that plant is, that there is nothing you're going to do in 1 year that's going to wipe those things out. But I prevailed and we did it. That fall, when our technician gave the report, they said, now that we're rid of the Canada thistle, we could go back to the original rotation. And all the farmers said, whoa, let's not do that. That's what caused the problem. We've since learned the science and the biology behind why was the thistle growing. There was a symbiotic organism, one of these endophytes, that the thistle needed to survive, could only live in an anaerobic environment. The thistle had these deep roots that were in the subsoil. And when the subsoil was anaerobic, where it couldn't get oxygen, subsoil was compacted. Those were the wet spots, the low spots. And with the system of farming we had, it was compacting them badly enough so that the oxygen was shut off. When that happened, suddenly Canada thistle had the environment that it needed. What we did when we changed our system was we allowed the thistle to bore holes and put the roots into that anaerobic environment. And then when we harvested the barley was harvested early enough that the thistle had just put all of its energy into new tops, and it aerated the subsoil. And we cut it and disrupted it to plant the second crop right at the stage when it needed to restore the roots. And that was the end of it.
So how did you have the idea to plant barley?
I had been shown something by an old farmer. He saw the first patch of thistle come, and he said, I'm going to show you something, and you need to pay attention. And he said, don't worry about your crop. You won't have one there anyway. So he went out into this thistle patch when it was full bloom, but none of the blossoms were ripe yet. And he mowed it. And that patch didn't come back. So my thinking was, by going to winter barley, it was harvested at exactly the time when he mowed that patch. So when we mowed the barley, we were taking the thistle down at that stage. And then we were disrupting the soil so it couldn't regrow. And there was a poem among farmers. It's interesting how a lot of peasant wisdom was passed down in rhymes. They used to say, cut them in May, they'll be back in a day. Cut them in June, they'll come back soon. Cut them in July and tell them goodbye. That's when the thistles were blooming. Climate changes those days now, but
we have to change our rhymes.
Yes.
But similar to how myths can pass down wisdom from generation to generation.
Yes, exactly. And a lot of this wisdom was something that was, because the knowledge is local, farming is local, these things develop. So the general principles covered a wide area, but the local methods stayed. So back to the farmers for 40 centuries, those were methods that were developed that they knew worked. And they were passed down and refined and improved. If it's sustainable, the society is going to continue to function like this. If it's not sustainable, we're going to have a major collapse. And there likely will be another society that comes in and invades and takes over. And we saw that happen over and over. The most recent one we learn about is the Romans. The Roman system grew wheat every other year. So it was wheat fallow. And eventually it wore the soil out, especially when they moved that system out of the Mediterranean into Northern Europe. And the Germanic system was 3 crops: oats, wheat, fallow, oats, wheat, fallow, which worked a little better. So you saw Rome fall as the barbarian tribes overran it. And then the Black Plague attacked England, and Sir Albert Howard's theory was that because of the continual, this was the Roman system still, of plowing and growing wheat, that the wheat yields dropped. But before the wheat yields dropped, their nutritional value went down. And when the nutritional value went down, we had a sick population. Think about my velvet leaf, that was just waiting for an invader to come cut through it, which was the bubonic plague.
Wow, I have not heard this perspective.
This was Sir Albert Howard's theory of the bubonic plague. And then the land laid idle because Europe had been depopulated in some places by up to 2/3, in a lot of places by half. And when that land laid, it regenerated itself. Mother Nature healing herself. And when that land was farmed again, it was richer. And Sir Albert said this was when the age of the Enlightenment started.
Mm.
People had better nutrition, and so the babies born at that time would have developed more intelligence, and you ended up with the great thinkers. We also, at that point, started using animals on farms more, and they would grow clover as a cover crop. So the farming went to oats, seeded to wheat, underseeded with clover, which was then a lay crop that could graze animals, added fertility, manure, and then they would go back and start the cycle over. Much more sustainable, much more productive. But he also acted the human health component and the intelligence and innovation.
That's fascinating. And that brings us back to thinking about the whole system and not isolating our health, not isolating a plague, not isolating even enlightening and intelligence, and taking it out from our system that we live in as humans and what our bodies need to thrive.
Yes. So if you think about this, organic farming is not going back to the way we farmed in the 30s. That was not sustainable. But there were some people at that point who said, yes, these solutions pointing at chemicals and fertilizers are a way to approach this. They're not the only one, and they're not the best one. And what they were pointing out was that using that method was changing our soil and having some long-term effects that were deleterious. It was getting short-term yields at the cost of long-term soil health, something humans have done over and over and over. And people like
at the
William
cost
Albrecht,
of nutrition.
yes, people like William Albrecht had seen that. But William Albrecht had read Sir Albert Howard, and Lady Eve Balfour in England was another person who saw this. The German playwright Goethe talked about this. Rudolf Steiner had pieces of it. So we had these thinkers through history who had made the same observations I'm talking about.
And that is extremely powerful if you're thinking about empires like the Great Roman Empire falling because of ignoring these principles.
That's right.
So we talked about the system and superorganism that nature is. We talked about how we can observe certain symptoms of imbalance like weeds or pests, and how that affects civilization's nutrition, health. And so I'm curious, if a young farmer, let's say, is listening to this, or someone who wants to learn more about how to understand our system and so that we can create more sustainable farming systems and better health for nature and humans, what would be some advice you would have or some resources that someone could look into?
Okay. One thing, I learned a lot of these concepts from William McDonough, of all people. He was an architect. I heard him speak once on designing systems and asking the correct questions. And one thing he said was that if it's not fun, it's not sustainable. Another observation that he brought up, which I thought was brilliant, He said
I
nature.
want to say one quick thing about if it's not fun, it's not sustainable. That sadly didn't make it onto the episode when I ran your bio by you and you said, "Well, I'm a farmer and everything else is for fun, but farming is also fun." So
Yeah, that's right.
it's 100% fun.
Yes.
So the first observation is if it's not fun, it's not
Yes.
sustainable.
Another one he gave was that nature is not efficient. Efficiency is a human concept. It's an engineering concept. But let's look at nature. And are a million apple blossoms efficient? Are millions and millions of pollen grains efficient? But they're fun and they're resilient. They're beautiful. So nature is abundant, but not efficient.
That's an
It's,
interesting
it's
distinction.
kind of an important concept to keep in mind.
And how does that apply to how we live our life?
Well, what are farmers being taught? Try to take more out and put less in. That's not exactly how nature works. When we go against how nature works, then we usually are on thin ice.
We anger Freya.
Yes, this is the bigger picture, but nature can teach us that by its abundance.
All right, those are two really important and quite maybe unintuitive at first concepts, especially like you said, our engineering concepts of valuing efficiency and fun is usually, and beauty and abundance are usually not valued as much in our society.
Yes. So I had a farmer in one of my talks once come up after I described how we manage soils, which is their little nudges in their upstream. That I know when we change this, it'll change that, it'll change that. It's a cascading effect. So that we're working with nature to just try to redirect her a little bit. He said, that's exactly how the martial arts work. That if you try to oppose a force, you're in trouble. And especially since nature is stronger than we are, we're doubly in trouble if we try to oppose. But we can work with nature and we can maybe direct the energy of nature in a way that will benefit both of us.
And that is what attracted me to learning about regenerative and organic farming and understanding systems that take that into account, working with nature, creating abundance. So thank you so much, Klaas, for giving us your experience and perspective and teaching us more about these systems. Before we wrap up, is there any other parting thoughts that you have? Anything else you would like to share with our audience?
Well, I see a pitfall. I've had a lot of farmers come to me for advice, and usually it's right after they've had somebody sell them on a program, usually an expensive program, and usually very expensive advice. And there's some common threads here. Usually it's not only very expensive, but it promises exceptionally high yields. But it puts the farmer in a spot where they have to have those high yields in order to survive. One of the problems we have, and it's been a problem throughout history, people have been enslaved, first physically with chains, but how many people are enslaved by debt? How many people are being enslaved by a system that keeps them hungry? Where there's not enough, where there isn't enough abundance. And that's a pitfall I want farmers to stay out of. It's very hard to be happy. It's very hard to have fun if you allow yourself to be put into a spot where you're under that kind of stress. And I think we can avoid it.
How could someone avoid this type of pitfall?
This is a test of questions. Say, will doing this make me happier? Will doing this make me more secure? Think it through. And quite often when I've counseled farmers like this, I ask them, well, what would be the worst thing that happens if your yields aren't sky high next year? And usually nothing bad. And I said, well, and what happens if you put yourself in this spot where they have to be sky high and it doesn't rain? Well, then I would be highly stressed, be fearful. And usually they discover that they could take a safer approach and have less pressure and end up in a happier spot.
Yes, and farmers' well-being and health is absolutely essential.
And stress can be really unhealthy. So we need to try to avoid stress. And another way that we avoid stress is having strong communities. We need our neighbors. We're in a system where we've been told there's not quite enough to go around. This is, again, efficiency. Giving less, taking more. So when there's not enough to go around, I've got to have part of yours to be satisfied. How can I be your neighbor if I'm looking at your farm and hoping you're going to fail so that I can have more land? Because there's not enough to go around. It's a lie, actually, of scarcity. When we look at the world, it's soil offers abundance. So we have to think abundance. When we think about abundance, then there's plenty for everybody. And we're richer if we have more neighbors. But the get bigger, get out mentality is teaching us that there's not enough to go around. We've got to compete with each other. And that destroys the communities, which is actually the strength that keeps us healthy and makes us safer.
So our human communities need to mirror nature's principles of abundance, of collaboration in a system for greater good.
Yes. And when I first farmed organically, there were 5 neighbors I found who were already farming organically. They didn't have enough markets to sell all their crops. Every one of them helped me, said, I want you to succeed, and sincerely meant it, and shared where they sold their crops with me. Now, from an ag economist standpoint, that was absolutely stupid. So why would someone give away something they don't have enough of? Within a year, we couldn't fill our markets. That's a whole other story of why, but it taught me something. That these people who gave away something they didn't have enough of ended up with more. Because they came at it with a sense of plenty instead of a sense of scarcity.
That's a powerful story and a powerful message, and a powerful narrative also to go as a counterculture to a lot of other narratives around scarcity that we have in our world today.
Yes.
And I think that's really a wonderful note to end our conversation on. Thank you for sharing that wisdom. I think it's helpful also beyond the farmer listeners. And I think we can apply this to all areas of our lives.
Yes, it's not a zero-sum game. When
Absolutely.
It's a zero-sum game, that's why I've got to have yours. We can actually gain by cooperating.
Exactly. We could create synergies, we can grow the pie, and we can create abundance.
That's right. And we're a whole lot happier when we're doing that because it's fun.
Yep, and we're having lots more fun.
Yeah.
So to having more fun and building more sustainable systems, more healthier systems within our communities and with nature. So thank you so much, Klaas, and I hope this resonates with our listeners, and I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day.
Oh, thank you. You too.
Thank you for listening to Seeds of Hope. Our wonderful theme music is composed by Dane Myers. If you enjoyed the show, please follow us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or YouTube so you never miss an episode. Share it with a friend who might find it inspiring. And if you're loving the podcast, we'd be grateful if you could leave a rating and review on Spotify, YouTube, or Apple Podcasts. It really helps others discover us. See you next time, and thanks again.